Well, joining us now to take this matter further is Dr Azar Jammine, Chief Economist at Econometrix, and Professor Keith Engel, CEO of South African Institute of Taxation. Good afternoon, Dr Jammine and also Azar. Thank you for joining us on Onpoint. Well, many questions there, a lot discussed in the budget. So I'm going to start off with Dr Jammine. What are the broader implications of the National Treasury having to table this new fiscal framework in terms of the country's credit rating and borrowing costs in international markets?
I don't think that this has a particularly negative effect on our credit rating and our borrowing costs. On the contrary, I think it's a very fortunate situation that we've found ourselves in, because between the 19th of February, when the first budget was presented, and the current situation, there's been a lot of turmoil on global financial markets and expectations of what the year ahead will bring as far as the global economy, and via that the South African economy, have changed materially, unfortunately, mainly for the worst. And so this does give the government an opportunity to revise its budgeted growth forecasts upon which to base the budget on a time-years basis, to be able to present something that is now going to be more realistic. It will be obviously a little more conservative,
yes,
and it involves greater austerity possibly being imposed,
yes,
but it is a worthwhile exercise that has been provided to us by sheer chance. I think the important message is that this whole exercise has also reinforced the commitment not only of National Treasury, but of all political parties, to the concept of the need to pursue fiscal discipline as a means of preventing economic growth sliding still further.
And of course, they'll have the opportunity now to incorporate or at least consider those US tariffs as well.
Correct. That's what I meant by
yes,
it's come at the right time, because things have changed since February,
sure,
and we will have a more realistic budget now.
Professor Engel, what role could targeted tax incentives play or relief measures in promoting economic growth while maintaining revenue stability?
Look, I'm surprised about tax incentives. At this point, I think that tax incentives are really not on the table.
Yeah.
But to be quite honest with you, tax incentives have not really worked to get economic growth.
Yeah.
You really need to have bigger factors at work. So I would suggest that really what you need is fiscal stability. That's the most important thing, and maybe a calming of the regulation. But I would not think tax incentives this time has really done much, and the few tax incentives we've had have been very ineffective.
What about tax compliance and administration challenges facing SARS due to the delay of the finalising and passing of the 2025 budget framework and tax legislation?
Okay, well, I think the bottom line is the revenue service is working rather well. They were 10 billion over, so the revenue service is just fine. The biggest problem is how much money you're going to spend going forward. The money we're spending right now is adequate, and the revenue raising system is adequate. The problem was in the budget that was proposed, it was they wanted to increase spending still further. So if you're going to increase spending still further and you're not going to raise taxes, you're just going to put more pressure on the revenue service.
Yes.
But I would say at this point, the situation is quite stable. They have gotten a lot of additional money. So there's definitely a belief on all sides that more money, if it's going to be raised, is through the revenue service. And I would say the revenue service is holding quite well. Maybe you can change some legislation to make things a little bit more effective. But generally, I would say the revenue service is on track.
Okay. Dr Jammine, Treasury says funding government services under Section 29 of the PFMA, allowing up to 45% of last year's budget initially. So that is in place, but does this temporary funding mechanism pose any risks to economic stability?
I don't believe that it does, unless what it involves is, for example, not being able to award public servants the additional wage increases that they were requesting over and above what had been agreed upon or stipulated in the budget. That could create a little bit of turmoil, but I think it's a very effective mechanism in providing continuity. And I think one of the really important messages that comes through is we've seen relative stability in the currency. That in itself is a marker of the manner in which financial markets are actually taking these developments in their stride and seeing that there are both not only negatives involved here, but also positives. I think the other positive that the minister himself has mentioned is this is a learning curve for all those involved in the government of national unity,
yes,
and a learning curve for the country to cope with coalition politics. From that point of view, it's not a bad thing. We were bound to encounter some hiccups,
sure,
and this is one of them.
Professor Engel, how could recalculating revenue projections impact the structure of personal income tax, corporate tax, or other levies in the 2025 fiscal year?
Well, in the 2025 year, it seems to me the minister is quite settled. He's not going to raise taxes. He made it quite clear. It looks like they're going to have to cut and trim on the fiscal framework side. The real issue for him is if he's going to get more revenue out of changing taxes, he has to change rates.
Yes.
And that's not something that's politically sustainable. Any other changes he makes will only take into effect in a later year in 2026, which is really too late for him. Again, the purpose of the tax increases, and that's why it was somewhat contentious, was it was to get more revenue from more spending. It wasn't about keeping the current budget as it was. So at this point, it seems pretty humble. I think, to be fair to the Minister of Finance, he's being very humble. He's saying, look, I'm going to engage. He's not pushing forward a tax increase. You don't hear that at all.
Yes.
It looks like it's stability on the tax side, with the revenue service expected to get additional revenue. So I wouldn't expect any change at this point. Again, next year is next year, and you might see these old fights coming back.
Dr. Jammine, what borrowing strategies could the budget adopt to minimise fiscal risks while funding essential services?
I think the borrowing strategies will remain in place,
yes,
as they have been in the past. Obviously, there will need to be a bit of tweaking of some of the numbers compared with previously, but we are not talking about a major change in the borrowing requirements here.
Yes.
We're talking about an increase, no question about it, because of lower economic growth, and unless we find ways of reducing expenditure, there will be a slight increase in borrowing requirements, but really of a magnitude that does not leave one particularly fearful and alarmed, especially when we are witnessing comments by leading officials, including the Minister of Finance, that actually lend credibility to the determination of the Government of National Unity to persist with a relatively conservative and responsible fiscal policy.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time today. That was Dr. Azar Jammine, Chief Economist at Econometrix, and Professor Keith Engel, CEO of the South African Institute of Taxation.